Hey, this is John with FixYourDirtBike.com, and this is how to service the steering stem bearings on your 1997 through 2001 Honda CR250. You will need 3 specialty tools for this service: a steering stem adjustment wrench, a long bearing press, and a metal pipe that matches the diameter of the inner bearing race but still fits over the steering stem. You can pick up a wrench for around $13, you can make your own bearing press out of grade 8 bolts and washers for about $15, and the pipe will cost between $10 and $25 depending on the store. You can see the rest of the tools and parts needed listed below. Start with your bike on a stand with the front end completely stripped except for one fork. Loosen and remove the steering stem nut and washer. Remove the other fork. Loosen and remove the steering stem adjustment nut and lower the steering stem out of the steering head. Clean all components and check for obvious damage or wear to the bearings and welds. Do not remove the lower bearing until you have cleaned and inspected it. Clean and inspect the steering head. The bearings are 2 pieces, with the outer race mounted in the steering head. Do not remove the outer races from the steering head until you inspect them. You want to look for damage in the bearing races and the welds connecting the head to the frame. These bearings and races are in surprisingly good condition, so I am not going to replace them. Instead, I'm going to show you on my 2009 CRF450R. While the bearings are slightly different, procedure is the same. The outer races are pressed into the steering head, and the lower bearing is pressed onto the steering stem. You will need a sharp screwdriver or chisel to remove the lower bearing from the stem. If you try to hammer the bearing down off the stem, you will only catch the seal ring or crush the outer cage. Instead, hammer your chisel between the bridge and the bearing and work your way around. This should separate the bearings from the bridge, but it probably won't. As with most worn-out parts, this bearing refused to budge, so I moved to a Dremel with a cutoff wheel. This is a tricky cut because you cannot get a perpendicular angle to the bearing. So start with a parallel cut about 2 millimeters from the bridge, then make 2 cuts in a V shape between the edge of the bearing and the parallel cut. Obviously, this is not ideal, but if you take your time and watch your depth, you'll be fine. I got a little too deep on my V-cuts, but it was nothing some light sanding and polishing couldn't fix. The outer bearing races have a small lip that stick out inside the steering head. Take a screwdriver or other long flat tool and hammer the race out of the steering head. Make sure to work around the race as you go. This is another example of old parts not cooperating, so I used a blind bearing puller to remove these. If you don't have a blind bearing puller set, do not buy one. Most chain auto parts stores have loaner tools available with a refundable deposit. With the outer race removed, inspect the race bores. If the edges and surfaces are anything but smooth, correct the damage before installing the new races. I will be installing an all-balls bearing kit. This kit includes new bearings, outer races, and seals. Slide the new seal onto the stem with the wide side facing away from the bridge, followed by the bearing with the small side facing away from the bridge. Drive the bearing home with your metal pipe and a hammer. Place your new bearing race in the bore with the wide side facing out. Assemble your bearing press with the bolt head on the side you are pressing. You will have to get creative with the spacers on the nut side. For example, I like to use the top bridge as a spacer because it rests flat on the bottom of the steering head. On the bolt side, you will need to find a washer that will fit over the race, but still clear the outer bore. As with most bearings, some slight adjustment may be needed to keep everything aligned. Press the bearing into the bore. These bearing races are not an interference fit, so they will press in easily. If you are forcing them in, something is wrong, so reset and try again. Run your fingernail along the bottom side of the race to check for gaps. My race did not press into the bore completely, but I was able to correct that with a large socket and a hammer. Repeat with the bottom race. Steering stem bearings require an EP grease. The EP stands for extreme pressure. Because there is little heat in the steering head, the grease can't be too thick or it will not move around the bearings. Moly-based greases provide the best protection under extreme load, but they are also extremely thick. General purpose grease is the right consistency, but provides poor pressure protection under load. I find that a lithium-based EP grease provides the proper level of protection at the right consistency. Apply a thick layer of grease around each bearing and outer race. When I say thick, I mean thick. You want as much grease in those rollers as possible. Install the top seal with the wide side facing down. Install and tighten the adjustment nut until it is bottomed out. With the nut tight to the seal, work the stem back and forth. This will disperse the grease and allow you to check for any rough spots. Loosen the nut to the point where the steering stem rotates freely with no play. Install the forks, but only tighten the upper pinch bolts. Install the steering stem nut and torque to 108 foot-pounds on 97 through 2000 models and 80 foot-pounds for 2001 models. Check the rotation again. You should still be able to rotate the stem freely with no play. Assemble your front end and ride around for about 30 minutes. After your break-in ride, put your bike on a stand and check the steering adjustment. With the wheel facing forward, you should be able to tap the fender left or right with the front end rotating to lock under its own weight. This is correct adjustment. If the front end does not turn freely, the adjustment nut is too tight. Push and pull on the forks. If you feel anything moving in the steering head, the adjustment nut is too loose. To correct the adjustment, loosen the lower fork pinch bolts, loosen the steering stem nut, and turn the adjustment nut 1/4 turn, then retorque the steering stem nut. Repeat this process until you reach the proper adjustment, then retorque your lower bridge pinch bolts. Remember, you can find this step-by-step guide and much more at fixyourdirtbike.com. If you have any questions about this steering stem bearing service, please let me know in the comments or on social. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe.